Understudy to disaster. Welcome back to Charles Paris Mysteries. Tonight, we leave the real world behind and step into the fluorescent-lit, hazard-taped world of corporate safety videos. It is a place where the air smells of machine oil and forced enthusiasm, and where the only thing cheaper than the budget is the loyalty of the cast. This mystery is an affectionate homage to the style of Simon Brett, but the twist is entirely our own. Here is a question for you tonight. Have you ever had to smile through a job where everyone actively wished you weren't there? Let me know in the comments. Your stories help fuel the atmosphere here. So, before you get comfortable, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It helps keep Charles in whiskey. Now, pour yourself a large Bell's, turn down the lights, and let's raise the curtain on Understudy to Disaster. Charles Paris was, to use the industry's preferred terminology, resting. It was a theatrical euphemism that carried a heavy weight of torpor and insecurity, neatly masking the fact that he was simply unequivocally and profoundly unemployed. To the uninitiated, resting might imply a period of serene recuperation after a grueling artistic triumph. For Charles, it meant sitting in a sagging armchair at 14 Hereford Road, listening to the radiator wheeze and trying not to calculate how many days remained until his next visit to the Lisson Grove Unemployment Office. He was a middle-aged actor of fluctuating fortunes, a man who possessed a sharp mind and a persistent, foolish hope that the next phone call would be the one to finally validate the fantasies of theatrical success he had nursed since his teens. Thus far, those fantasies had largely manifested as bloody, awful bit parts, the occasional provincial pantomime, and playing characters who were required by the script to really smell of failure. Currently, his bedsit smelled heavily of damp wool, stale tea, and the fumes of depression that routinely threatened to choke him during these barren stretches. He had spent the morning pretending that the absence of work was a philosophical position, a brave stand against the commercialization of modern drama. He was an artist, maintaining his integrity in a shallow world. He was also entirely out of cash, and the coin meter for the gas ring was eyeing him with grim finality. When the telephone finally rang, shattering the dusty silence of the room, Charles did not leap toward it. He let it ring 3 times, cultivating an aura of an in-demand professional stepping away from a vital script reading before picking up the receiver. It was his agent, Maurice Skellen, a man who treated finding work for his clients as something that went fundamentally against his religion, yet always seemed remarkably cheerful about it. And a cheerful Maurice usually meant something humiliating was about to happen. Chapter 1. Hereford Road, Short Notice Glory. "Charles, dear boy," Maurice Skellen's voice crackled through the earpiece, accompanied by a vague, wheezing laugh that sounded like a punctured accordion. "You're a notoriously hard man to get hold of." "I was deep in a text, Maurice," Charles lied smoothly. The only text he had been deep in was a final demand from his electricity provider. "To what do I owe the pleasure? Has the National Theatre finally realized their glaring oversight?" "Not quite the National, dear boy. No," Maurice said, entirely missing the sarcasm. He sounded brisk, businesslike, and dangerously mercenary. "But I do have a little something. Immediate start. Needs a safe pair of hands. I thought of you instantly. Let's have lunch. My club in Soho, 1 o'clock. Don't be late." The line went dead before Charles could ask whether a safe pair of hands meant playing a corpse or merely a man standing very quietly in the background of a commercial for denture adhesive. Still, the promise of lunch paid for by Maurice, presumably out of the 20% commission he religiously extracted from Charles's own meagre earnings, was enough to force Charles out of the sagging armchair. He put on his least threadbare jacket, splashed his face with cold water, and stepped out into the unforgiving grey drizzle of London. Maurice's chosen establishment was a faux traditional dining club in Soho that smelled aggressively of expensive vinegar, starched linen, and desperation masquerading as networking. By the time Charles arrived, Maurice was already seated in a plush corner booth, looking thoroughly pleased with himself. A gin and tonic rested in front of him, smelling brisk, botanical, and infinitely superior. "Ah, Charles," Maurice beamed, gesturing for a waiter. Sit, sit. Drink? I'm having another. Just water for now, thank you, Charles said, maintaining a neutral expression. His stomach gave a hollow, rebellious rumble. Nonsense, Maurice declared. We're celebrating. I'll have the prawn cocktail to start, waiter, and then the steak and chips, medium rare. Charles, what about you? The soup of the day is usually very robust. The soup of the day will be fine, Charles said, swallowing his pride along with the complimentary bread roll. He watched Maurice sip the fresh gin and tonic, calculating how many days of his own heating allowance that single glass represented. Right, Maurice said, dabbing his mouth with a napkin as the prawn cocktail arrived. To business. It's a corporate job, Charles. Charles felt his heart sink slightly, the familiar bathos of his profession washing over him. He had spent his youth dreaming of Hamlet and Lear. He was now squarely in the demographic of men hired to lend gravitas to instructional videos about the correct posture for lifting heavy boxes. Corporate, Charles echoed. Fascinating. Selling life insurance? Or explaining the dangers of office stationery? Safety video, Maurice said, cheerfully decapitating a prawn. Industrial machinery. Forklifts, conveyor belts, that sort of thing. It's shooting out at a factory park in Acton. Very well funded. They had a chap booked, but apparently he had an attitude problem. An attitude problem? Charles raised an eyebrow. He demanded a chair between takes, Maurice explained, waving his fork dismissively. The production manager fired him on the spot. They called me an hour ago in a blind panic. They need a replacement by tomorrow morning. I told them Charles Paris is nothing if not dependable. You're not a name, dear boy, which is perfect for this. They don't want an ego. They want someone who can read lines off a clipboard without making a fuss. Someone who smells of failure, you mean, Charles murmured, staring into his tepid bowl of indeterminate soup. Exactly, Maurice agreed, entirely immune to irony. But here is the sweetener, Charles. You won't just be talking to an empty factory floor. The client has brought in a heavyweight to anchor the whole thing. A trusted face. They've hired Sir Basil Drayton. Charles stopped with his spoon halfway to his mouth. Sir Basil Drayton. The man was a national treasure, a fixture of Sunday evening television dramas for 3 decades. He possessed a voice like aged port and a public persona of saintly, grandfatherly wisdom. He was beloved by the nation, a knight of the realm, and according to every piece of theatrical gossip Charles had ever picked up at the Montrose Club, an absolute monster to work with. Sir Basil Drayton, Charles repeated slowly. In a corporate safety video? Tax reasons, one assumes, Maurice said, tucking into his steak and chips with carnivorous enthusiasm. Or alimony. Who knows? His fee is astronomical, which means the budget for the rest of the cast, namely you, is strictly scale. But think of the exposure, Charles. Sharing a screen with Sir Basil. Yes, Charles said heavily. Sharing a screen where I am the despised replacement for a fired actor, reading warning labels while Sir Basil collects a cheque the size of a mortgage. That's the spirit, Maurice said, oblivious. Call sheet is in the post. They need you in Hi-Vis by 8 a.m. sharp. Don't let me down, dear boy. The rest of the lunch was an exercise in endurance. Charles watched Maurice chew his way through a prime cut of beef while he quietly finished his watery soup, his mind already bracing for the ritual humiliation to come. He knew exactly what it meant to be the replacement on a tense set. The crew would already be behind schedule, the fired actors' friends would be nursing grudges, and Charles's name would be hastily scribbled onto the call sheet in blue biro, a literal afterthought. He left Maurice in Soho, the agent's asthmatic laugh still echoing in his ears, and took the tube back to Bayswater. The damp chill of Hereford Road seemed even more profound upon his return. The walls felt closer, the silence louder. He hung his jacket on the back of a chair and stared at the empty grate. Corporate videos, high-vis vests, serving as a human prop for an egomaniacal national treasure. He tried to tell himself that it was all performance. Acting was a noble craft, whether one was delivering blank verse at the RSC or demonstrating the catastrophic results of loose clothing near a motorized winch. It was the same discipline, the same emotional truth. It was a beautiful, lofty thought. It lasted exactly 3 seconds before the sheer, grim reality of a factory estate in Acton crushed it flat. Charles sighed, admitting defeat to the quiet room. He walked over to the small cupboard above the sink, reached past a dusty tin of baked beans, and pulled out the bottle of Bell's whiskey. It was half empty, a reliable companion of failure. He didn't bother with a glass. He poured a large Bell's into a slightly chipped mug, took a long, burning swallow, and felt the familiar, spreading glow act as a sedative for his depression. To Sir Basil, Charles toasted the empty bedsit, his voice wry and self-deprecating. And to the glorious, unpredictable magic of the actor's life. He took another sip, shivering as the draught from the window hit his neck, and prepared himself to be entirely invisible by morning. Chapter 2. Hi-Vis Theatre. Charles arrived at the Acton industrial estate just as the early morning drizzle was upgrading itself to a vindictive downpour. The location for the day's corporate video was a sprawling corrugated steel warehouse that smelled profoundly of oil, rubber, and cardboard dust. The environment immediately established his professional vulnerability. This was not the West End, nor even a drafty fringe theatre above a pub. This was the bleak, low-status reality of the jobbing actor, a world governed by the relentless, atonal beeping of reversing forklift trucks. Inside, the factory floor was a temple to industrial efficiency, bathed in a harsh, fluorescent glare that seemed designed to highlight every wrinkle on a man's face and every failure in his career. The walls were adorned with safety posters that read less like helpful advice and more like aggressive threats about the fragility of human limbs. A bored-looking security guard directed Charles to the green room, which turned out to be the factory's staff break room. It was a masterpiece of depressing utility. The air hung thick with the ghosts of microwaved curries and the sour tang of instant coffee. In the corner, a vending machine hummed with a low, vibrating frequency that perfectly matched Charles's own internal frequency of despair. He stood there in his damp coat, taking in his indigent bass line. He was an actor who had spent over 30 years navigating fluctuating fortunes, and this room was a stark reminder of his place at the absolute fringes of the working world. The production team, when Charles finally located them, operated in a state of highly caffeinated panic. The director, a young man named Julian, who looked as though he had internalized far too many synergy seminars, possessed a smile that belonged on a glossy corporate brochure. He was busy explaining his vision to a line producer who was clutching a clipboard and worshipping the day's shooting schedule with the desperate devotion of a man carrying a large mortgage. "We need dynamic authenticity," Julian was telling the line producer, waving his hands expansively. "I want the audience to feel the danger of the pallet stacker." Nearby stood the factory's safety manager, a stern-faced individual who watched the film crew with deep suspicion, treating any sign of artistic joy as a potential spill hazard. Drafted into the background were several actual factory workers, corralled into a holding area where they provided background authenticity while looking universally bored. Charles approached the line producer to announce his arrival. The man barely glanced up, demonstrating the classic industry invisibility quotient applied to actors of Charles's standing. "Right. You're the replacement," the line producer said, his voice tight with stress. "Wardrobe is a box by the fire exit. Grab a high-vis and a hard hat. And try to stay out of the way until we need you." Charles's status as the unwanted replacement worsened the moment he reached the wardrobe box. The crew, it transpired, were deeply loyal to the actor who had been fired that morning for demanding a chair. They viewed Charles not as a colleague, but as a scab. A burly grip accidentally knocked into Charles's shoulder, offering a distinctly unapologetic grunt, while the camera assistant conveniently forgot to point out Charles's blocking marks on the floor. When Charles finally fished a high-visibility vest from the box, he found it was at least 3 sizes too large, hanging off his frame like a fluorescent smock. He looked entirely ridiculous, an artist reduced to performing menial labor for a day rate. Then the atmosphere in the warehouse shifted. The low hum of conversation stopped. The line producer stood up straighter. Julian, the director, fixed his brochure smile firmly in place, and even the safety manager looked mildly impressed. Sir Basil Drayton had arrived. The national treasure stepped onto the factory floor with the effortless, practiced grace of a man who knew his face was entirely beloved by the British public. He was dressed in a tailored suit that probably cost more than the entire safety video budget, his silver hair perfectly coiffed. On television, Sir Basil projected an image of sensible, bright, and understanding wisdom. He was the grandfather the nation wished it had. Privately, as Charles well knew from the gossip pipelines of the Montrose Club, Sir Basil was a spectacular monster. He was notoriously cruel, excessively handsy with junior production staff, and fundamentally contemptuous of anyone earning less than £1,000 a day. "Darlings!" Sir Basil boomed, his theatrical voice echoing off the corrugated steel. "Are we ready to save the working classes from their own clumsiness?" Julian rushed forward, fawning instantly. "Sir Basil, an absolute honour. If I could just talk you through the motivation for the first setup." "Motivation, dear boy?" "The motivation is my tax bill," Sir Basil replied smoothly, patting Julian on the cheek with patronising affection. He turned, his sharp eyes scanning the crew until they landed on Charles, who was standing awkwardly in his oversized high-vis vest. Sir Basil's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Ah, and who is this?" "That's Charles Paris, Sir Basil," Julian said nervously. "He's stepping in for today." "I see. The spare," Sir Basil said, his tone dripping with the kind of condescension usually reserved for an unpleasant smell. He walked over to Charles, invading his personal space. "What happened to the other fellow? Spine gave out from the sheer weight of the dialogue?" "Scheduling conflict," Charles lied politely, deploying his standard tone of wry self-deprecation. "I'm merely here to provide the contrast, Sir Basil, to make your performance shine all the brighter." Sir Basil chuckled, a dry, joyless sound. "Well, let's see if you can manage basic English, shall we?" "Whatever your name was." "Julian, let's run the interlock demonstration." The scene required Charles to stand next to a massive, dormant pressing machine and deliver a single, mind-numbingly dull line of technical jargon about engaging the safety interlock before operation. Sir Basil was to stand in the foreground, nodding sagely. "Action!" Julian called out. Charles stepped up to his mark, which he had to guess at, since the camera assistant still hadn't taped it down and pointed at the machine. Always ensure the mechanical safety interlock is fully engaged before commencing the cycle. "Cut," Sir Basil interrupted immediately, not even waiting for Julian. He sighed heavily, turning to the crew with a look of theatrical martyrdom. "No, no, no. Darling boy. You're simply reciting words. Where is the gravitas? You are speaking to men who might lose their fingers. Give me peril. Give me Shakespearean dread. Again." Charles gritted his teeth, his professional ego stinging. He was being treated to a ritual humiliation. He took a breath. "Always ensure the mechanical safety interlock." "Cut!" Sir Basil barked again. "Too loud. You're a safety instructor, not a town crier. Try it with a bit of intimacy. Seduce the machine, dear boy." For the next 20 minutes, Sir Basil forced Charles to repeat the single, inane line over and over again. He made Charles do it happily, then angrily, then with a slight limp just for his own sadistic amusement. The crew snickered. Julian, the director, stared at his shoes, entirely unwilling to rein in his star. Charles felt the familiar flush of defensive embarrassment, trapped in a humiliating farce, while fully aware that he desperately needed the paycheck. He swallowed his pride, nodded obediently, and delivered the line exactly as demanded, masking his internal loathing behind a bland, professional smile. Eventually, Sir Basil grew bored of the game. "Better," he lied smoothly. "We'll fix the rest in the edit. I need tea. Proper tea, not whatever industrial runoff is in those urns." As the crew scrambled to locate Earl Grey in an industrial park, Charles retreated to the shadowy perimeter of the set, trying to massage the tension out of his jaw. The fluorescent lights hissed above him. It was there, standing behind a towering stack of wooden pallets, that Charles overheard the argument. The voices were hushed but vicious, echoing slightly in the cavernous space. Charles recognized the clipped, stressed tones of Derek, the line producer, and the smooth, dangerous purr of Sir Basil Drayton. "You can't just unilaterally demand a renegotiation on the day of the shoot, Basil," Derek was hissing, sounding genuinely panicked. "The contract is signed." "Contracts, Derek, darling, are as disposable as used tissues," Sir Basil replied smoothly. "And I've seen the updated usage rights your legal team tried to slip past my agent. You want to use my face for your European subsidiaries as well? That costs extra." "A lot extra." "We don't have it," Derek pleaded. "The budget is locked. If you walk now, the client will pull the whole campaign." Charles peeked through a gap in the pallets. Sir Basil was smiling, but it was a cold reptilian expression. He reached out and tapped Derek sharply on the chest. "Then find the money, Derek. Because if you try to shortchange me or hold me to that ridiculous initial clause, I won't just walk. I will go directly to the tabloids. I will tell them exactly what I found out about your little operation here. How many extras have you been paying off book to keep the unions quiet? How many safety logs have been completely fabricated to keep your output numbers up?" Derek visibly paled, his walkie-talkie trembling in his grip. "You wouldn't." "I am a national treasure, Derek," Sir Basil said, his voice dropping to a theatrical whisper. "The press prints whatever I tell them to print. Now, be a good boy and make the call. I want the amended figure in my account by midday, or I am leaving, and this entire corporate charade burns to the ground." Sir Basil turned on his heel and walked back toward the lights, leaving the line producer staring after him, looking entirely hollowed out. Charles leaned back against the cold steel of the warehouse wall, his actor's intuition suddenly twitching. This wasn't just a corporate video anymore. The ecosystem of this particular production was highly unstable, built on a foundation of blackmail, paperwork, and reputation. He rubbed his temples, feeling the dull ache of a caffeine withdrawal setting in. It was barely 9 in the morning, and he was already trapped in a toxic web of corporate anxiety and showbiz ego. He looked around the vast, dangerous factory floor, suddenly intensely aware of the heavy machinery, the deep pits, and the swinging chains. Charles sighed, resigning himself to the chaos. He made a mental note to locate a pub immediately after the shoot wrapped. He was definitely going to need a large bells tonight. Chapter 3. The demonstration goes wrong. By 11 o'clock, the production had moved to the primary loading bay, a cavernous space that felt less like a workplace and more like a cathedral dedicated to the worship of heavy logistics. At the center of this industrial theatre stood the automated pallet stacker. It was a terrifying piece of machinery, a towering exoskeleton of yellow steel and hydraulic pistons designed to lift 2 tons of tightly bound cargo and swing it effortlessly onto a high-level conveyor belt. Julian, the director, was buzzing with an excess of creative adrenaline. He wanted a dynamic safety sequence, which, in the language of corporate videos, meant trying to make a near miss look as cinematic as a car chase. The setup was simple. The stacker would swing a loaded pallet across the bay. Sir Basil Drayton would stand safely behind a line of orange traffic cones, and the machine's automated safety interlock would theoretically prevent it from ever crossing into the human-occupied zone. "It's all about the illusion of peril," Julian explained to the crew, his brochure smile straining at the edges. "We want the audience at home, or, well, in the employee break room, to feel the weight of the hazard, while Sir Basil demonstrates the life-saving power of the perimeter line." Charles Paris stood off to the side, his oversized high-vis vest rustling as he crossed his arms. He had been relegated to the background again, instructed to look attentively cautious, while Sir Basil did the actual acting. Sir Basil, however, was not satisfied with the illusion of peril. He had spent his morning bullying the crew, and now he turned his attention to the physics of the set. He stared at the orange cones, marking the boundary of the machine's operational arc. "Julian, darling, this is entirely anemic," Sir Basil announced, his voice carrying effortlessly over the hum of the factory floor. "If I stand back here, I look like a frightened pensioner waiting for a bus. The camera won't catch the reflection of the steel in my eyes. I need to be closer. Sir Basil, the cones represent the absolute safety limit." Derek, the line producer, interjected nervously. He looked as though he had aged 5 years since their argument behind the pallets. The machine's proximity sensor is calibrated to that line. Then recalibrated, Sir Basil snapped, the grandfatherly charm evaporating instantly. He stepped boldly past the orange cones, planting his expensive leather shoes a good 3 feet into the designated hazard zone. "I am standing here." It gives the shot an edge. Danger makes a man look younger, Derek. And heaven knows this script needs all the help it can get. Charles watched, expecting the safety manager to immediately intervene. The stern-faced man, whose name tag read Harris's, was standing by the main breaker box. Harris frowned, looking from Sir Basil to the massive yellow arm of the stacker, but to Charles's surprise, he said nothing. He merely adjusted his hard hat and looked away. "Well, if Harris says it's all right," Julian muttered, immediately caving to the star's gravity. "Let's just shift the cones to Sir Basil's new mark. Quickly, everyone. We're losing the momentum." A junior runner hastily dragged the orange cones forward, effectively redrawing the boundary of safety around Sir Basil's vanity. Charles felt a prickle of unease. In the theatre, moving a mark by 3 feet could mean missing a spotlight. In a factory, moving a mark meant flirting with industrial blunt force trauma. But the series of events was unfolding with the relentless, unthinking momentum of a bad rehearsal. "Quiet on set!" the assistant director shouted. "Rolling and action!" Sir Basil puffed out his chest, adopting a mask of stern, authoritative concern. "In the modern warehouse, efficiency is vital," he intoned, his voice a rich, resonant baritone. "But efficiency must never come at the cost of—" Behind him, the automated pallet stacker hummed to life. The massive hydraulic arm rotated, a ton of wooden pallets suspended from its steel forks. It swung through the air in a terrifyingly swift arc, moving directly toward the newly established perimeter. It was supposed to stop. The mechanical interlock, sensing the proximity of the cones and the actor, was designed to freeze the hydraulics instantly. But the machine did not stop. The heavy steel arm swung cleanly past the original safety line, past the newly moved cones, and directly into the space occupied by Sir Basil Drayton. The impact was sickeningly dull. There was no theatrical scream, no dramatic final monologue. The stacker's load simply connected with Sir Basil's chest and shoulder. The sheer, indifferent force of the machinery, lifting him off his feet and pinning him violently against the unyielding steel uprights of the storage racking. The wooden pallets buckled under the pressure, splintering with a sound like breaking bones. The event was not a simple whodunit, but a horrifying, performance-related death. The theatrical artifice had suddenly, brutally, turned into lethal reality. For a fraction of a second, the factory floor was gripped by a sudden, absolute hush. The only sound was the high-pitched whining of the stacker's hydraulic pump, straining against the obstacle. Then the screaming started. "Cut! Cut!" the assistant director shrieked. His voice cracking. Chaos erupted. Julian was yelling for someone to reverse the machine. Derek, the line producer, was backed against a wall, his hands over his mouth, his face the colour of wet ash. Factory workers rushed forward, shouting over each other, their voices echoing and becoming meaningless in the huge space. The air, previously smelling of coal dust, was suddenly thick with the tang of hot metal, leaking hydraulic fluid, and the sharp, unmistakable scent of panic sweat. Charles felt his stomach drop, a cold knot tightening in his gut. He had spent his life dealing with the manageable disasters of missed cues and forgotten lines. He was entirely unprepared for the brutal finality of industrial slaughter. He stumbled forward, but Harris, the safety manager, was already there, slapping the emergency stop button on the stacker's control panel. The machine shuddered and died, but it was far too late. The next hour was a blur of flashing blue lights and formalized procedures. The police arrived, accompanied by paramedics, who took one look at the scene and immediately transitioned from urgent rescue to grim recovery. The factory management swiftly cordoned off the area, their faces set in expressions of practiced, sombre liability. Charles sat on a plastic chair in the break room, a polystyrene cup of cooling tea trembling in his hands. The atmosphere was heavy with shock. Police constables were moving through the crew, taking statements. Charles listened as Derek and Julian gave their accounts. The narrative was already being formed, solidifying with every repetition. It was a tragedy, Julian told, a tired-looking sergeant. His brochure smile entirely vanished. He insisted on standing too close. We tried to warn him. He stepped over the line and the machine. It just didn't register him in time. Factories are inherently hazardous environments, a senior operations manager added smoothly, hovering near the police. Accidents happen, despite our most rigorous protocols. A tragic, unforeseeable equipment malfunction. It was a clean, logical story. The police seemed inclined to accept it. The primary motives in the industry were usually money, paperwork, or reputation. And an accident neatly covered all three. Paperwork would follow, insurance would pay out, and the factory would scrub the stain from its floor. But as Charles sat there, the initial shock began to recede, replaced by a cold, nagging sensation in the back of his mind. He was not a heroic sleuth, but he possessed an actor's ingrained sensitivity to the mechanics of a scene. He investigated using the tools of his trade rather than standard police procedure. He closed his eyes, replaying the catastrophic performance in his head. He applied his actor's logic to the stage business and the props. First, there was the blocking. Sir Basil had demanded to move his mark, yes. But someone, the safety manager, Harris, had allowed the cones to be physically shifted into the machine's fatal operational arc. In any production, moving a mark required ensuring the lighting and the mechanics followed suit. Here, the hazard was allowed to eclipse the actor. Second, the technical inconsistency. The safety interlock on the machine had completely failed to engage. Charles remembered the argument he had overheard. Sir Basil had threatened to expose the falsification of safety logs. If Harris was already doctoring paperwork, bypassing a proximity sensor on a control board was merely a physical extension of the same lie. Finally, there was the audio cue. Charles replayed the exact moment of the impact in his auditory memory. The assistant director had shrieked, "Cut! Cut!" But Charles realized, with a sudden, chilling clarity, that the assistant director hadn't shouted after the impact. The frantic cry of "Cut!" had rung out a fraction of a second before the pallets struck Sir Basil. It was a missed cue. The assistant had shouted because he, or someone standing right next to him, had anticipated the hit. They hadn't reacted to an accident. They had reacted to a scheduled event. Charles opened his eyes, staring at the lukewarm tea in his cup. The police saw a piece of industrial equipment that had tragically malfunctioned. Charles saw a meticulously staged trap. Someone had used the blocking, the timing, and the technical mechanics of the set to orchestrate a murder. He looked across the room at Derek, who was frantically texting on his phone, and at Harris, who was calmly pouring himself a coffee. The ecosystem of this production was rotten, and a man had been killed to protect the paperwork. Charles carefully set his cup down. He needed to get out of the fluorescent glare. He needed to find the nearest public house, and he needed a very large bells. The farce was over. The real performance was about to begin. Chapter 4. Pub Gossip, Industrial Truth. The pub, the King's Ransom, sat on the edge of the Acton industrial estate like a dirty afterthought. Inside, it was a masterclass in atmospheric despair, smelling profoundly of stale beer, damp coats, fryer grease, and a cheap lemon disinfectant that entirely failed to mask the underlying scent of defeat. In the corner, a fruit machine jingled with frantic, unrewarded optimism, while the distant, phantom beeps of reversing forklifts seemed to linger in Charles's memory like guilt. Charles Paris stood at the sticky mahogany bar, feeling the full weight of his years. He possessed a bruised shoulder from being shoved off his mark earlier, and his cheap, off-the-rack suit now carried the permanent, cloying reek of factory oil. It was in moments like these that Charles usually tried to summon the lofty ideals of his profession. Acting, he reflected as he stared at the beer taps, was fundamentally a noble calling. Even in the context of a corporate video, performance held the power to illuminate the human condition. A perfectly delivered safety message could, in theory, save lives, elevating the actor to a guardian of the working man. It was a beautiful, sustaining thought entirely necessary for a man surviving on fluctuating fortunes. However, this grand philosophical stance was immediately undercut by his physical misery. He shifted his weight, wincing as his bruised shoulder throbbed, and caught his reflection in the mirror behind the bar. He did not look like a guardian of the working man. He looked like a man auditioning for minor bankruptcy. The bartender, a young man who looked as though he had never smiled in his life, approached, wiping the sticky surface with a rag that had seen better decades. "What'll it be?" "A large bells," Charles said, his voice carrying the dry rasp of a man who had seen too much. He considered the exorbitant price the bartender quoted, mentally subtracting it from the day rate he was increasingly certain he would never receive, and handed over a crumpled note. He called it research. After all, Charles investigated using the tools of his trade rather than standard police procedure. For an actor, the most potent investigative tool was not a magnifying glass, but the strategic application of alcohol to loosen the tongues of traumatized crew members. He took his glass and waded into the sea of high-vis vests. The crew from the warehouse had migrated here en masse, drinking their pints with the grim, determined rhythm of men taking medicine. The atmosphere was a volatile mix of shock, adrenaline, and a creeping, unspoken relief that the tyrant of the set had been violently deposed. Charles spotted the camera assistant and the burly grip who had earlier treated him with such contempt. The sudden proximity of death had levelled the social hierarchy. Charles pulled up a stool, set his bells on the sticky table, and raised a hand. "Rounds are on me, gentlemen," Charles announced, summoning the bartender over the noise. "I suspect we all need to wash the taste of corrugated steel out of our mouths." Resentment loosens remarkably quickly when lubricated by free lager. Within 2 pints, the crew had accepted Charles not as the replacement, but as a fellow survivor of the Acton disaster. The conversation naturally gravitated toward the late Sir Basil Drayton, and the gossip pipeline opened wide. "Tragedy, obviously," the camera assistant mumbled, staring into the frothy dregs of his pint. "Terrible thing to happen to a national treasure, but between you and me, Charles, the man was a monster." "A complete liability," the grip agreed, wiping foam from his upper lip. "I worked with him on a BBC period drama 3 years ago. He got a spark fired because the lighting made his chin look insufficiently heroic. The man was universally despised." Charles nodded sympathetically, taking a measured sip of his whiskey. It served as a nerving agent, sharpening his focus while simultaneously providing a sedative for the sheer horror of what he had witnessed. He certainly seemed intense this morning. I overheard him having a rather spirited debate with Derek. "Spirited?" Derek was terrified of him. The camera assistant snorted. "Derek's been running this corporate gig on a shoestring. He's been paying half the background extras off book. Cash in hand, no union fees, no tax. If head office found out, he'd be ruined. Sir Basil found out this morning." "Ah," Charles said softly. The primary engines of crime in this industry were usually money, paperwork, or reputation. And Sir Basil threatened to expose him? Threatened to go straight to the tabloids unless Derek doubled his fee and gave him European usage rights for free. The grip confirmed, leaning in closer. "I heard him say it. I am a national treasure, Derek. The press prints whatever I tell them." Derek looked like he was going to be sick. Charles filed the information away. Blackmail driven by vanity and greed, it was a classic theatrical motive. But Derek was a line producer. His weapons were spreadsheets and passive-aggressive emails. Would he really orchestrate a fatal mechanical accident? "What about Harris?" Charles asked casually, signalling for another round. "The safety manager." He seemed remarkably unbothered when Sir Basil demanded to move the safety cones. The 2 crew members exchanged a dark, significant look. "Harris is a company man," the camera assistant said quietly, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "His bonus is tied to keeping the output numbers high. Every time a machine stops for a safety check, it costs the factory thousands. So, Harris. He gets creative with the logs." "Creative?" Charles prompted. "He falsifies them," the grip said bluntly. "We all know it. He signs off on maintenance, that never happened. Bypasses the interlocks when a sensor gets too sensitive. Sir Basil was poking around the breaker boxes earlier, complaining about the noise. He's a famously litigious bastard. If he got a whiff that the safety logs were fabricated, he could have sued the factory for placing him in a hazardous environment. Or worse, dragged Harris's name through the mud. Charles finished his bells, letting the warm, peaty alcohol settle in his stomach. The ecosystem of the corporate video was entirely corrupt. Sir Basil Drayton, behind his grandfatherly facade, had been a walking bomb, threatening to detonate the careers and livelihoods of everyone around him. Derek, the line producer, was facing financial ruin and professional disgrace. Harris, the safety manager, was facing criminal negligence charges if his doctored paperwork was exposed. Both men had motive. Both men relied on the boring, essential paperwork that drove the industry. And both men had been on the factory floor when the pallet stacker's safety interlock mysteriously failed. Charles stood up, feeling a slight, familiar buzz. The police were looking for an equipment malfunction. But Charles knew he was looking for a performer, someone who had calmly and quietly acted the role of a devastated bystander while knowing exactly when the curtain was going to fall. "Gentlemen, thank you for the company," Charles said, buttoning his oil-stained jacket. "I think I need to get some fresh air. Or, failing that, the Central Line." He left the pub and stepped out into the damp Acton evening. He needed to organize his thoughts, and there was only one place he could go to find clarity. He needed the moral discipline of someone who didn't view a fatal industrial accident as an inevitable consequence of bad scheduling. He needed Francis. Chapter 5. Muswell Hill. Competence. The journey from the industrial bleakness of Acton to the leafy, middle-class enclave of Muswell Hill took over an hour on the tube, affording Charles ample time to let the adrenaline curdle into a deep, pervasive weariness. He emerged from the station into the damp evening air, pulling his collar up against the drizzle. He was navigating by pure instinct now, drawn toward the only fixed point in his increasingly chaotic universe. He walked up the familiar path of the semi-detached house, stepping over a slightly loose paving stone he had meant to fix a decade ago. This house represented the moral and practical norm of his existence. It was a space that remained restfully familiar, like riding a bicycle, a sanctuary he instinctively sought when feeling particularly bad or impotent against the world's sharp edges. As he inserted his key into the lock, a privilege he was still, somewhat miraculously, allowed to retain, he noticed a thoroughly sensible, tightly furled black umbrella resting in the ceramic stand by the door. It was an executive umbrella, a meticulous, unimaginative umbrella. It undoubtedly belonged to David, the school's inspector and Francis's current lover. Charles felt the immediate, sharp prick of jealous arrogance. He had been the one to walk out on the marriage years ago. Yet he remained deeply pained by the idea of Francis leading an independent life. The presence of David was a constant, looming threat, a reminder of his own permanent displacement. Charles deliberately draped his oil-stained, damp coat over David's immaculate umbrella and walked toward the light spilling from the kitchen. Frances Parris was standing by the sink. Her role as a headmistress provided the stability and respectability that Charles so conspicuously lacked. She was the absolute picture of unruffled calm. In a display of terrifying competence, she was simultaneously watering a row of potted geraniums with a small copper jug, keeping a watchful eye on a simmering kettle, and marking a towering stack of earnest paperbacks with a vicious-looking red pen. The kitchen smelled of clean detergent, damp potting soil, and the warm, golden promise of Earl Grey tea. It was an environment of profound order, standing in sharp contrast to the dusty bedsit in Hereford Road, where Charles spent his days nursing his fading fantasies of theatrical success. "Hello, Charles," Frances said, not looking up from the essay she was currently devastating with her pen. Her tone was calm, authoritative, and only mildly frosty. "You look terrible, and you smell intensely of fried onions and— Is that hydraulic fluid?" "An astute observation on both counts," Charles sighed, collapsing into a sturdy pine chair at the kitchen table. He felt like a ghost haunting his own previous life. "It has been a spectacularly bad day, Francis. A man died this morning." That finally stopped her pen. Frances looked up, her expression shifting from mild exasperation to genuine concern. She possessed an infinite capacity for eternal forgiveness, acting as a maternal figure who invariably provided tea when Charles was at his lowest. She set the red pen down, turned off the kettle, and brought 2 steaming mugs to the table. "I'm listening," she said, sitting opposite him. The scratching of her pen had ceased, leaving a quiet, expectant verdict hanging in the air. Charles wrapped his hands around the warm mug, letting the heat seep into his cold fingers. He began to explain, filtering the brutal industrial accident through his own actor's vocabulary. He described the vast, echoing warehouse, the harsh fluorescent lighting, and the immediate, crushing humiliation of being the despised replacement on a tense set. He then detailed the arrival of Sir Basil Drayton. He explained the man's saintly public facade and the cruel, handsy monster that existed off-camera, describing how Sir Basil had used his power to belittle the crew and rewrite the terms of his employment. Then came the demonstration, Charles said, his voice dropping. He sketched out the scene: the massive pallet stacker, the orange safety cones, and Sir Basil's vain insistence on standing too close to the hazard to ensure the camera caught the reflection of steel in his eyes. "They moved the cones," Charles explained, tapping the kitchen table to emphasize the point. "They physically shifted his mark into the machine's operational arc, and then the safety interlock, the sensor that was supposed to stop the machine, simply failed. It swung right through the boundary and crushed him against the racking." Frances frowned, her headmistress' instincts immediately parsing the narrative for logical inconsistencies. "And the police believe it was a tragic malfunction?" "They do," Charles nodded. "The factory management was very quick to push the narrative of an unforeseeable mechanical failure. They practically had the press release written before the paramedics arrived." "But you don't believe it was an accident," Frances stated. It wasn't a question. She knew him too well. "It's the stage business, Frances," Charles said, leaning forward. "He was investigating using the tools of his trade. It's the mechanics of the scene. When you move a mark on a stage, the lighting and the cues have to follow. In a factory, moving a mark into a danger zone requires ensuring the safety mechanisms still apply. But someone allowed those cones to be moved. And worse, someone bypassed the machine's interlock. How can you be sure?" "Because of the audio cue," Charles said softly. The assistant director yelled, "Cut!" A fraction of a second before the machine hit Sir Basil. He didn't react to an accident. He reacted because he knew, or someone standing right next to him knew, exactly what was about to happen. It was a missed cue. The timing was entirely wrong. Frances took a slow sip of her tea, digesting the information. She did not dismiss his theatrical logic. Instead, she translated his artistic observations into the cold, hard reality of administrative procedure. "You're looking at this like a director, Charles," Frances said practically. "You need to look at it like an auditor. If someone staged this, it wasn't done with theatrical magic. It was done with keys, switches, and authorization." She pulled a blank piece of paper toward her and picked up her red pen again. "Let's deconstruct the boring paperwork. Who has physical access to the machine's override switches?" "Harris," Charles answered immediately. "The safety manager. The crew told me he routinely falsifies maintenance logs to keep the factory's output numbers high. Sir Basil was poking around the breaker boxes this morning. He threatened to expose the whole operation to the tabloids if the line producer didn't double his fee." "Motive," Frances noted, writing the word down and underlining it sharply. "Blackmail over fraudulent paperwork. If Harris is already doctoring safety logs, bypassing a proximity sensor is just a physical extension of his daily routine. Who else?" "Derek, the line producer," Charles offered. "He was terrified. He's been paying background extras cash in hand to avoid union fees. Sir Basil was threatening to ruin him. Derek was the one arguing with him just before the shoot." "More motive," Frances said, writing Derek's name. "But does a line producer know how to bypass an industrial interlock? Or would he have to hire someone? You need to trace the accountability, Charles. Who controls the cone lines? Who profits if the star dies and the production is shut down?" Charles stared at the paper. Francis had effortlessly cut through the emotional chaos of the factory floor, anchoring the investigation in logistical triangulation. "You need to look at the shift logs," Francis continued, tapping her pen against the paper. "Check the CCTV coverage. Find the machine override records. The police will ask for them eventually, but if your safety manager is already prone to falsifying documents, he will be using this time to erase his digital footprints." She was right. The unmasking of the killer wouldn't happen in a dramatic monologue. It would be found in the contradictions of the paperwork, the quiet, chillingly practical incentives that drove the industry. Charles smiled, a genuine expression that felt rusty on his face. "You are terrifyingly competent, Francis. Have I mentioned that recently?" "Not since you needed me to explain your tax return in 1998, Francis replied dryly, standing up to clear the mugs. "Be careful, Charles. You are an actor, not a health and safety inspector. If someone has already committed murder to protect a falsified logbook, they won't hesitate to arrange another accident for a nosy extra who asks too many questions." "I am the understudy to disaster," Charles said, rising from his chair. He felt grounded again, his emotional grid temporarily stabilized by her calm authority. "I merely observe the performance. I'll stick to the shadows." He walked back out to the hallway, retrieving his damp coat. He deliberately let it drag slightly across David's immaculate umbrella. It was a petty, childish gesture, but it made him feel marginally better about stepping back out into the cold, shifting economy where he remained a vagabond. "Thank you for the tea, Francis," he called back. "Don't get yourself crushed, Charles," she replied from the kitchen, her voice already returning to the rhythmic scratching of her red pen. Charles stepped out into the Muswell Hill night, armed with a practical plan and a renewed sense of purpose. He needed to get back to the Acton industrial estate tomorrow, infiltrate the production office, and start reading the reviews of Harris, the safety manager's back catalogue of lies. Chapter 6. Billing Red Herring. The following morning, the Acton industrial estate looked no less grim, though the persistent drizzle had at least washed some of the surface grime into the overflowing gutters. Charles Paris approached the main warehouse with the heavy, dragging footsteps of a man whose career consisted largely of surviving long periods of fluctuating fortunes. The production was officially paused pending a full health and safety review, a sanitized corporate phrase that effectively meant the client was currently screaming at their legal department while everyone else waited to be sacked. Before Charles could even cross the threshold of the corrugated steel cathedral, his mobile phone vibrated in his coat pocket. He pulled it out, immediately recognizing the number. It was Maurice Skellen, his longtime agent, a man who rarely found him work but was spectacularly efficient at collecting his 15 to 20% commission on the jobs Charles inevitably found himself. "Charles, dear boy!" Maurice's voice crackled, falsely sincere, and accompanied by his trademark asthmatic wheeze. "I've just seen the morning papers. Absolute tragedy about Sir Basil. The Montrose Club is absolutely buzzing with it. They say he was practically bisected by a tractor." "A pallet stacker, Maurice," Charles corrected wearily. He knew perfectly well that Maurice was primarily motivated by gossip and a purely mercenary interest in his commission. The agent functioned as a switchboard for the theatrical industry, where information spread through vanity and resentment. And it was quick. But yes, a tragedy. "Dreadful, dreadful," Maurice said, managing to sound entirely unbothered. "Now, the vital question, Charles. Are you still on the clock? Has the production company officially stood you down, or are you still accumulating your day rate?" Charles looked at the grey sky, contemplating the bleakness of his bank balance. In the entertainment industry, truth was a luxury item he could rarely afford. "I am currently on site, Maurice, assisting with the logistical transition." "Splendid," Maurice chirped. "Keep your head down. Don't sign anything admitting liability, and make sure they log your hours. Every cloud, Charles. Every cloud. I'll call you if anything else turns up." "Things are very quiet at the moment, Charles. Very quiet." The line clicked dead. Charles pocketed the phone, his tone of wry self-deprecation settling firmly back into place. He was an indigent, resting actor sleuth, constantly wavering between the humiliation of his stagnant career and the grim necessity of paying the rent. He bypassed the main security desk. The guards were too busy arguing with a pair of tabloid journalists at the outer gate, and slipped into the temporary production office. It was a hastily erected porter cabin tucked into a corner of the loading bay. The air inside was thick, smelling stale and intensely of hot photocopier toner, cheap instant coffee, and the sharp, acidic sweat of corporate stress. Charles investigated using the tools of his trade rather than standard police procedure. He simply adopted the persona of a man who absolutely belonged there. He picked up a stray clipboard, put on a pair of reading glasses he didn't strictly need, and began to rifle through the chaos on the line producer's desk. Francis had told him to deconstruct the boring paperwork that drove the industry. The primary motives for murder in this world were usually money, paperwork, or reputation. He found a stack of risk assessments. They were all signed by Julian, the director, and Derek, the line producer, but a cursory glance revealed they were boilerplate documents, entirely divorced from the physical reality of the factory floor. They were signed by people who clearly hadn't read them. Then, buried beneath a pile of catering receipts, Charles found a printed email thread. It was an exchange between Julian and the client's marketing executive, sent just 2 days prior. Charles adjusted his glasses. The emails painted a picture of a director on the verge of a nervous breakdown. Julian was obsessed with his award-winning safety campaign, viewing it as his ticket out of corporate instructional videos and into mainstream television. Sir Basil Drayton, however, was actively ruining it. The emails detailed Sir Basil's refusal to read the script, his constant, unscripted improvisations, and his absolute contempt for Julian's direction. "The man is a dinosaur," Julian had written in the final, frantic email. "He is making a mockery of the brand share. If he pulls one more stunt on set, I am cutting his performance from the final edit entirely. I'll shoot around him. I'll replace his voiceover. We are not sacrificing this campaign for his ego." Charles tapped the clipboard against his chin. To a man like Sir Basil Drayton, being cut from a production was a fate worse than death. It was the ultimate insult. And if Sir Basil had discovered Julian's plan to erase him, the resulting explosion would have been catastrophic. Sir Basil would have walked, kept his astronomical fee, and publicly destroyed Julian's reputation, treating it as disposable as a used tissue. It was a classic billing red herring. Julian had the motive. He had a blazing row with Sir Basil about how he looked on camera. He feared the star's tantrums would ruin his future contracts. But as Charles stood in the cramped porter cabin, his actor's logic kicked in, analysing the behavioural performance of the suspects. Julian was a screamer. He was loud, vain, and entirely reliant on grand theatrical gestures. He managed by throwing tantrums. The murder of Sir Basil Drayton, however, had required a completely different kind of performance. The unmasking of the killer required understanding the failure of a performance. The culprit had to be someone invisible. It required the quiet, chilling competence to access the breaker box, bypass the mechanical interlock with a piece of tape, and confidently shift the orange safety cones while everyone else was distracted. It required someone who understood the logistical mechanics of the scene, not the emotional drama. Julian couldn't have done it. He was too busy being the centre of attention. Charles placed the emails back under the receipts. He was looking in the wrong place. The vanity of the director was a distraction. The real power lay with the people who controlled the keys, the logs, and the safety overrides. He stepped out of the porter cabin and back onto the vast factory floor. The environment was aggressively hostile. The cold air bit through his cheap suit, and the metallic echoes of distant machinery made the fluorescent glare feel even more oppressive. Without the chaotic bustle of the film crew, the warehouse felt like a cavernous trap, making everyone who walked through it look like a potential suspect. Charles decided to head toward the management offices on the mezzanine level to track down Harris, the safety manager. He chose a path that took him through the secondary storage aisles, towering canyons of steel racking stacked high with heavy engine parts and industrial lubricants. He walked briskly, his footsteps echoing. The silence was unnerving. Then he heard the distinctive, high-pitched beep of a forklift truck shifting into reverse. It sounded close, too close. Charles paused, looking over his shoulder. The aisle behind him was empty. He turned back, taking another step forward. Suddenly, from a blind intersecting aisle to his left, a forklift surged forward at an alarming speed. It wasn't carrying a load. The twin steel forks were raised to chest height, gleaming maliciously under the strip lights. Charles froze for a fraction of a second, his mind struggling to process the sudden intrusion of danger. The series relied heavily on a tonal flip, a moment where a comedic or clumsy beat suddenly revealed genuine threat. He threw himself backward, falling sprawlingly to the ground. The forklift didn't slow down. It swept past the spot where Charles had been standing an instant before, the heavy steel forks missing his face by inches. The driver, their face entirely obscured by the shadow of the roll cage and a pulled-down hard hat, yanked the steering wheel hard. The rear of the forklift swung out, clipping the base of the steel racking beside Charles with a deafening crang. The impact sent a violent shudder up the towering shelves. High above, a poorly secured wooden pallet holding several heavy steel alternators shifted ominously. Charles scrambled on his hands and knees, his breath catching in his throat. He threw himself under the bottom shelf of the opposite rack, just as the pallet above gave way. The heavy alternators plummeted, smashing into the concrete floor exactly where Charles had landed moments before. The noise was apocalyptic, a brutal cacophony of shattering wood and ringing steel. A sharp fragment of pallet wood ricocheted off the floor, tearing a jagged hole in the sleeve of Charles's jacket and grazing his arm. Silence slammed back down on the aisle, broken only by the settling dust and Charles's own ragged breathing. He lay pinned under the bottom shelf, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The forklift had already vanished down a distant cross aisle, its engine noise fading into the general hum of the factory. It was subtle, plausible, and entirely deniable. A man walking in a restricted forklift lane, a careless driver taking a corner too fast, a tragic secondary accident on a cursed set. If Charles had been an inch slower, the police would have simply added his name to the bottom of the incident report, another victim of industrial hazard. But Charles knew it wasn't an accident. It was a warning. He slowly crawled out from under the racking, his hands trembling as he brushed the dirt from his ruined trousers. The farcer to threat switch had been thrown with lethal force. He was no longer just an understudy snooping through paperwork. He had placed himself directly in the path of a real killer. Someone in this factory knew he was asking the wrong questions. Someone with access to the machinery, who understood the blind spots and the safety protocols, had just tried to violently cancel his contract. Charles stood up, wincing as the fresh graze on his arm throbbed in time with his racing pulse. He desperately needed to retreat to the restfully familiar safety of Francis's kitchen, but he was trapped here until he found the truth. He looked at his shaking hands. He was definitely going to need a large Bell's, assuming he survived long enough to drink it. Chapter 7. Farce in the Safety Cage. Charles Paris decided to abandon the direct approach. Asking questions in a porter-cabin had nearly resulted in his permanent removal from the cast list via a ton of falling alternators. He knew that he was not a heroic sleuth. His deductions had to rely on theatrical skills rather than standard police procedure. The real power in this ecosystem lay with the men who controlled the boring, essential paperwork that drove the industry. He needed to spy on the safety manager, Harris, and the line producer, Derek, but he needed to do it using the tools of his trade. He tracked them from a discreet distance across the vast, echoing expanse of the factory floor. The afternoon shift was in full swing, creating a cacophony of clanging metal, squawking walkie-talkies, and the ubiquitous, nerve-shredding beeps of reversing machinery. Charles observed Derek and Harris walking briskly toward a secluded, dimly lit loading bay at the rear of the facility, far from the prying eyes of the remaining film crew. Charles needed a vantage point. He needed to be invisible, infiltrating the space, using the cover story logic of a man who simply belonged in the background. He slipped into the loading bay just as the two men disappeared behind a towering stack of corrugated cardboard bales. Looking around for a place to conceal himself, Charles spotted a bright yellow, heavy-gauge steel safety cage resting securely on the forks of a dormant forklift truck. It was the sort of contraption used to elevate maintenance workers to high-level racking. It was currently sitting flat on the concrete floor, its wire mesh door hanging slightly ajar. It was a ridiculous hiding place, perfectly aligned with the slapstick clumsiness that so often characterized Charles's investigative methods. He felt intensely foolish as he squeezed his frame through the narrow door, crouching low on the cold diamond-tread metal floor. The cage smelled sharply of oil tang, damp rust, and the lingering scent of stale sweat. He had barely pulled the mesh door shut when Derek and Harris rounded the cardboard bales, stopping less than 10 feet from the forklift. Charles held his breath, pressing his cheek against the cold metal mesh. The factory noise was slightly muffled back here, allowing the sharp, panicked hissing of Derek's voice to carry perfectly. "The client is demanding a full audit of the safety logs, Harris," Derek was saying, his voice vibrating with stress. He sounded like a producer facing the exasperation of a large mortgage and imminent professional ruin. "They're talking about bringing in independent investigators. This isn't just about Sir Basil anymore. If they look at the history, they'll see the pattern." "Let them look," Harris replied. His voice was entirely devoid of panic. It was dry, chillingly practical, and utterly terrifying in its calm. "The logs on the main server have already been updated. The maintenance was signed off." "But Sir Basil knew," Derek protested, pacing back and forth. "He was going to expose the previous cover-up. He knew about the accident last year, Harris. He knew the worker didn't just slip. He found the drafts of the old incident reports in the porter cabin. He told me he was going to end us all if I didn't triple his fee and give him a massive settlement with a non-disclosure agreement. He was blackmailing the company. And now he is dead," Harris pointed out reasonably. "A tragic, unforeseeable equipment malfunction. Sir Basil stepped over the line, the proximity sensor failed, and the machine performed its function. The police have accepted it. The insurers will accept it. Stop panicking, Derek. You'll give yourself away." "I can't do this," Derek whispered, his silhouette trembling in the dim light. "If they find out you bypassed that interlock. If they find out it was murder." "They won't," Harris said softly. "Unless you lose your nerve. Go back to the office, Derek. Look busy. Look devastated. I have to move this forklift out of the bay before the night shift arrives." Derek nodded frantically, turning on his heel and half-jogging back toward the main factory floor, desperate to put distance between himself and the truth. Charles remained frozen in a tight crouch, his knees aching. The primary motives of money, paperwork, and reputation had finally converged perfectly. Harris had committed murder to protect a £1 million cover-up, recognizing that Sir Basil's reputation and loud mouth threatened to expose years of criminal negligence. Charles waited for Harris to walk away so he could slip out of the cage and retreat. But Harris didn't walk away. Instead, the safety manager stepped purposefully toward the forklift. Charles realized, with a sudden, icy jolt of terror, that his infiltration had just reached the signature tonal flip of his career. The comedic, clumsy beat of hiding in a metal box was about to reveal genuine danger. Harris hadn't seen him. But Harris was climbing into the driver's seat of the forklift. The heavy diesel engine roared to life, shaking the entire steel chassis. Charles grabbed the wire mesh, his knuckles turning white. Before he could shout, the hydraulics engaged with a sharp hiss. The safety cage jerked violently, throwing Charles off balance. He fell heavily against the side of the cage as it suddenly lifted off the ground. 3 feet, 5 feet, 10 feet. The cage swayed sickeningly. Charles scrambled to his knees, looking down through the mesh. Harris was sitting in the cab below, his hands expertly manipulating the control levers. Charles opened his mouth to shout, to announce his presence and end the farce, but the words died in his throat. He caught a glimpse of Harris's face in the forklift's rearview mirror. Harris was looking directly up at the cage. He was smiling. He knew Charles was in there. He had probably known the moment he walked into the loading bay. The farce-to-threat flip had occurred because Charles's performance had placed him directly in the path of a real killer, and his disguise had been seen through completely. The cage continued to rise. 15 feet, 20 feet. The air around Charles suddenly felt far too big, the cavernous ceiling of the warehouse looming ominously close. The cold metal bars of the cage offered no comfort. The rhythmic, echoing beeps of the forklift shifting into gear sounded like a countdown. Harris drove the forklift slowly out of the loading bay and into the narrow, high-sided canyon of the main storage aisles. On either side, heavy steel racking rose 30 feet into the air, loaded with tons of unsecured industrial materials. Charles was trapped, swaying precariously in mid-air. He was an understudy caught in a lethal production, with no script and no director to call cut. Harris stopped the forklift in the middle of a deserted aisle. He pulled a lever. The massive steel forks supporting the cage began to tilt forward. The cage groaned, the metal base scraping against the steel tines. Gravity grabbed Charles, sliding him toward the front mesh door. The drop below was 25 feet of unforgiving concrete. "Harris!" Charles screamed, abandoning all pretense of dignity. "Stop the machine!" Down in the cab, Harris merely adjusted his hard hat. He nudged the tilt lever a fraction further. The cage slipped another inch. It was a terrifying, deniable execution. It would be written off as another tragic accident, an unauthorized actor playing about in restricted equipment, resulting in a fatal fall. Charles knew he couldn't reason with the man. Harris was an auditor of human lives, and Charles was just a rounding error. Charles had to survive through the chaotic kindness of other humans. He had to make a scene. He gripped the wire mesh, took a deep breath, and utilized the only genuine skill he possessed, a voice trained to reach the back row of the cheapest provincial theatre. "Fire!" Charles roared, his voice booming off the corrugated steel roof, carrying the sheer, unadulterated terror of a man facing imminent death. "Help! Fire! In aisle 4! Medical emergency!" He didn't stop. He kicked the metal floor of the cage repeatedly, creating a deafening, rhythmic clanging that echoed like an alarm bell through the warehouse. He screamed until his throat felt raw, projecting his voice over the hum of the engine. For 10 agonizing seconds, nothing happened. The cage slipped another millimeter. Then Charles heard the sound of running boots. 2 factory workers in high-visibility vests sprinted around the corner of the aisle, their faces pale with alarm. "Hey! What's going on up there?" one of them yelled. Down in the cab, Harris swore violently. The performance was ruined. He possessed the quiet competence to commit murder, but he couldn't do it in front of witnesses. Harris immediately pulled the tilt lever back, leveling the forks with a jarring clank. He leaned out of the cab, adopting a mask of irritated authority. "Nothing's wrong," Harris shouted down to the workers. "Just doing a stress test on the lift mechanisms. Didn't realize the bloody actor had climbed in there to play about." Harris engaged the lowering hydraulics. The cage descended smoothly, the terrifying expanse of air shrinking until the metal base hit the concrete floor with a solid, reassuring thud. Charles didn't wait for Harris to unlock the door. He kicked the latch open, tumbling out of the cage and landing hard on his hands and knees. His legs felt like jelly, his heart hammering against his ribs with a violence that made him dizzy. "You all right, mate?" one of the workers asked, stepping forward to help Charles up. "You shouldn't be messing about in the lifting gear. It's lethal." "Yes," Charles gasped, leaning heavily against the side of the racking. He stared directly at Harris, who was sitting in the cab, his face an unreadable mask of cold, thwarted intent. "Yes, it is extremely lethal. Thank you. I think I've had enough rehearsing for one day." Charles didn't look back. He walked away on shaking legs, his professional vulnerability never feeling more acute. He had survived the farce, but the threat remained. He walked out of the warehouse, past the security desk, and straight out of the industrial park gates. He didn't stop until he reached the sticky mahogany bar of Time's The King's Ransom asterisk. He collapsed onto a stool, his hands trembling so violently he could barely extract his wallet. He needed his coping mechanism. "A large Bell's," Charles croaked to the bartender. "Please, immediately." When the glass arrived, he didn't toast the magic of the actor's life. He simply drank it down, praying the peaty warmth would act as a sedative for the sheer terror of his fluctuating fortunes. His hands slowly stopped shaking, but the cold realization remained. He knew who the killer was, but proving it would require staging a performance more dangerous than the one he had just survived. Chapter 8. Actor Logic, Machine Logic. The morning following his near-fatal ascent in the safety cage, Charles Parris returned to the Acton industrial estate with a head throbbing from the residual effects of the Bell's whiskey and a grim determination to force the final act. The factory was unusually subdued, the metallic roar of production reduced to a nervous, idling hum. The police had come and gone, taking their preliminary statements and leaving behind a pervasive atmosphere of institutional anxiety. Charles knew that waiting for the authorities to uncover the truth was a fool's errand. He investigated using the tools of his trade rather than standard police procedure. The police were looking for an engineering flaw. Charles was looking for a behavioral inconsistency. He needed to observe the failure of a performance. He found Julian, the director, and Derek, the line producer, standing near the craft services table, both looking as though they had slept in their clothes. Harris, the safety manager, was hovering nearby, projecting an aura of practical, unsurprised resilience. Charles approached the group, adopting a persona of helpful, slightly flustered bureaucracy. He pitched his voice to carry just enough to ensure Harris was listening. "Derek, a quick word," Charles said, looking appropriately grave. "I've just had a rather alarming conversation with Maurice, my agent. He's been fielding calls from the insurance assessors." Derek flinched, pulling his coat tighter around himself. "What do they want?" "The police have already signed off on the initial report. It seems the insurers are less easily satisfied when multi-million-pound payouts are involved," Charles lied smoothly, utilizing logistical and documentary triangulation to set his trap. "They aren't looking at the physical machine. They're demanding the digital footprint. Specifically, they are sending a team this afternoon to impound the central server." Harris slowly turned away from the coffee urn, his expression perfectly neutral. "The server?" Julian asked, his brocious smile flickering briefly into existence before dying again. "What for?" "Machine override logs and the unedited CCTV feeds for the exact minute of the incident," Charles elaborated, watching Harris out of the corner of his eye. "Apparently, if the interlock was manually bypassed at the breaker box, it leaves a time-stamped digital signature in the main system. The insurers believe that if the logs contradict the physical evidence, the factory's liability cover is entirely void." The silence that followed was heavy and sharp. Derek looked terrified. Julian looked confused. But Harris simply set his coffee cup down with absolute precision. The trap was set. Charles was testing their reaction to a staged revelation, a mechanism he had successfully employed before. Charles excused himself, retreating to the shadowy perimeter of the loading bay. He waited in the cold air, listening to the metallic echo of the factory floor. He didn't have to wait long. 10 minutes later, Harris detached himself from the production group and walked swiftly toward the rear of the warehouse, his boots clicking purposefully against the concrete. Charles followed, his actor's instinct guiding him through the labyrinth of steel racking. Harris did not go to his office. He went directly to the primary electrical switch room, a restricted area housing the factory's main server racks and heavy-duty breaker panels. Charles slipped through the heavy fire door just before it clicked shut, concealing himself behind a towering, humming transformer. The harsh strip lights illuminated Harris as he unlocked a metal cabinet. The safety manager's face was tight with concentration. He wasn't acting the part of the grieving colleague anymore. The mask had completely slipped. Harris pulled a heavily encrypted digital tablet from his jacket and plugged it directly into the server's diagnostic port. He was typing rapidly, attempting to wipe the override logs before the Phantom insurance team arrived. The primary motive was paperwork, specifically the need to protect a fraudulent reputation built on falsified safety records. "You're too late, Harris," Charles said, stepping out from the shadows. Harris jumped, his hand instinctively dropping toward the heavy steel wrench resting on the cabinet shelf. He spun around, his eyes narrowing as he recognized Charles. "The actor," Harris breathed, his voice dripping with contempt. "I should have dropped you from that cage yesterday when I had the chance. It would have been a rather clumsy encore." Charles replied, keeping a safe distance. He could feel the familiar farce to threat switch engaging, the comedic artifice of his lie revealing a cold, lethal reality. Sir Basil found out about the fatal accident you covered up last year, didn't he? He found the drafts of the old incident reports and realized you had been falsifying the maintenance logs to keep your output numbers high. He was going to expose you. Harris didn't deny it. He gripped the wrench, his knuckles white. Sir Basil was a parasite. He demanded £250,000 to keep his mouth shut. It would have bankrupted the division and sent me to prison. I simply allowed his own colossal ego to be his undoing. By bypassing the interlock and moving the safety cones, Charles deduced, his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system, you orchestrated a performance. You let him step over the line, knowing the machine would not stop. It was an industrial accident, Harris said coldly, taking a slow step forward. The machinery idling around them sounded like a held breath. Just like the one you are about to have. You shouldn't have wandered into a high-voltage area unsupervised, Mr. Paris. It's a classic, tragic mistake. Harris lunged. Charles ducked, the heavy steel wrench whistling inches past his ear and smashing into the metal casing of the transformer with a shower of blue sparks. The confrontation was entirely devoid of elegance. It was a clumsy, desperate struggle. Charles stumbled backward, his foot catching on a thick bundle of power cables. He fell hard onto the concrete. Harris loomed over him, raising the wrench for a final, decisive blow. Charles knew he was not a fighter. He had to rely on the chaotic kindness of other humans, just as he had in the safety cage. He filled his lungs and utilized his theatrical projection. "Derek!" Charles bellowed at the top of his lungs, his voice ricocheting off the steel walls. "Julian! In the switch room! He's whipping the server!" Harris hesitated, glancing nervously toward the heavy fire door. That fraction of a second was all Charles needed. He kicked out wildly, his heavy boot connecting squarely with Harris's kneecap. Harris grunted in pain, stumbling sideways. The wrench clattered to the floor. Before Harris could recover, the fire door burst open. Derek and two burly security guards, drawn by the echoing shouts and the promise of corporate sabotage, piled into the room. Harris froze, realizing the performance was irreparably broken. He looked at the server, then at the security guards, and finally at Charles, who was slowly picking himself up from the floor, his cheap suit now dusted with concrete powder and electrical soot. "He was trying to destroy the logs," Charles said breathlessly, pointing a trembling finger at the safety manager. "The police will find the bypass signature right there on the screen." Harris slowly raised his hands in a gesture of defeat, his practical, businesslike demeanor crumbling. The murderer had been unmasked through a staged confrontation, caught by the very boring paperwork he had killed to protect. Charles leaned against the wall, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm. He closed his eyes, listening to the jingle of the security guards' keys and the sudden, chaotic shouting of the production crew spilling into the corridor. The climax was over. It was time for the bitter clarity of the aftermath. Chapter 9. Resting again. The resolution of the Acton industrial disaster was swift, sanitized, and thoroughly cynical. Within 48 hours, the corporate video was officially paused pending review, a polite industry term that meant the footage would be permanently buried in a legal vault. The factory issued a beautifully crafted, formalized prose statement expressing profound shock and sorrow at the isolated actions of a rogue employee. Legal teams bloomed like toxic algae, and suddenly everyone on the production was pretending that Sir Basil Drayton had been a universally beloved saint rather than a tyrannical blackmailer. The industry's reputation management machinery moved with terrifying efficiency. The narrative was cemented. A tragedy, a rogue actor, a terrible loss. Reputations were treated as disposable as used tissues. As for Charles Paris, his involvement was concluded with a polite email from an assistant line producer thanking him for his flexibility and confirming that his 2 days of scale pay would be processed within the standard 90-day window. He was thanked politely and dropped quickly. Replacements, after all, were easy to discard once the crisis passed. The ending was wryly unresolved, lacking any sense of moral repair. The murderer had been caught, yes, but the underlying corruption, the off-book payments, and the relentless pressure of the production schedule remained entirely intact. Charles was sitting in his dusty bedsit at 14 Hereford Road, watching the streetlights cut through the thin curtains like cheap, unforgiving spotlights. The radiator wheezed a familiar, comforting tune of persistent inadequacy. He was back to his indigent baseline, the fragile hope of short-notice glory thoroughly extinguished. The phone rang. It was Maurice. "Charles, dear boy!" Maurice's voice was aggressively cheerful, entirely unburdened by the grim realities of the past week. Maurice believed in forward momentum, even when the vehicle was currently on fire. "I just saw the news about the safety manager. Incredible stuff. You always did have a knack for finding the drama, Charles." "It found me, Maurice," Charles said tiredly, his voice a dry rasp of melancholic realism. "Has the production company officially dissolved?" "Completely," Maurice confirmed, sounding almost delighted by the chaos. "But fear not, dear boy. I have a lead. A touring production of Charlie's Aunt. They need an understudy for the brass-rubbing scene. It's mostly standing in the dark, but it pays equity minimum. Shall I put you forward?" "Standing in the dark," Charles murmured. It felt like an uncomfortably accurate metaphor for his entire existence. "Yes, Maurice. Put me forward. I am, as always, exceptionally available." "That's the spirit," Maurice chirped. "I'll call you when I have the details. Things are looking up, Charles." Charles hung up the phone. He looked around the cramped, cold room. The status quo had settled back in, precarious and indigent as ever. In show business and industry alike, he reflected, the safest thing was always the story they chose to tell. The truth was merely an inconvenience to be edited out in post-production. He walked over to the sink, stepping over a pile of unread scripts. He reached into the cupboard, his fingers brushing past the tin of baked beans, and pulled out the bottle. "A large Bell's," Charles said aloud to the empty room, pouring a generous measure into his chipped mug. He raised the mug to the peeling wallpaper, a solitary toast to the victims of vanity, the resilience of paperwork, and the enduring, farcical tragedy of the resting actor. He took a long, slow drink, waiting for the familiar warmth to rinse away the sordid truths of the week. The bedsit at Hereford Road smelled faintly of damp wool, old paper, and the sharp, peaty comfort of warm whisky. The streetlights from the Bayswater Road painted long, theatrical shadows across the ceiling. A silent audience to another quiet defeat. Charles took a slow breath, letting the alcohol burn its familiar path downwards, a liquid sedative for the sheer exhaustion of having survived another week in the margins. The world of the corporate video had proven to be no different from the West End stage. Both were ecosystems sustained entirely by the fragile masks of reputation and the brutal, boring supremacy of paperwork. Sir Basil had died not because of a tragic flaw in his character, but because his colossal ego had threatened a spreadsheet. Harris had killed not out of passion, but to protect a falsified logbook. The truth was just another physical prop, easily shifted, easily bypassed, and quickly buried under a mountain of non-disclosure agreements. It was a stark reminder of the industry's ultimate cynicism. The lights went down, the cast was replaced, and the machine simply reset itself for the next performance. There was no grand justice, only the small, quiet decencies of surviving long enough to secure the next audition. Charles took another sip from his chipped mug, staring into the amber depths. Acting was a mug's game, but it was the only game he knew. The curtain always falls, but the rent is always due. The ghostlight remains burning on the empty stage, casting long shadows over the discarded scripts and unpaid bills. Tomorrow, the phone might ring with a promise of West End glory, or it might just be another provincial pantomime smelling of damp costumes and quiet desperation. Come back when the stage door opens again. There is always another role to play, and always another tragedy waiting in the wings.